right, let's get started. Well, thank you all for being here for the last panel of the Collier Awards Symposium, Minimizing Harm When Working with Vulnerable Sources. We're so glad to have still a really good group to engage with this really, really incredibly important topic. And I could not think of a better panel to talk through some of the intricacies and subtleties of working with marginalized groups and victimized communities. I'm going to just start by giving a brief introduction of our panelists for folks who might not know them. Starting here, we have Helen Benedict, who is a novelist and journalist specializing in refugees, the effects of war on civilians and soldiers, social injustice and violence against women. One of her most famous books that we'll talk about today is called The Lonely Soldier, about women serving in the US military. She also is faculty at Columbia Journalism School. She's here in part because she was an advisor to Ariane Luthi, who was one of our student finalists who reported on the Afghani pilot and his family who were left behind. So we're so glad to have Helen on the panel to talk about advising Ariane and then also about her incredible work as well. Next to her, we have Julie Scharper and Jessica Calefati from the Baltimore Banner. Julie Scharper is an enterprise reporter for the Baltimore Banner. Her work ranges from investigations into allegations of sexual harassment and abuse to lighthearted features. She does it all. And a Baltimore native, she worked for the Baltimore Sun for nearly a decade as a City Hall enterprise and features reporter. Jessica Calefati is an education investigative reporter for the Baltimore Banner, focused on Maryland kids. And she previously covered Johns Hopkins University for the Banner, so a nice connection with a previous panelist, Kathy Wong. And then at the very end, we have Max Siegelbaum and Rong Xiaoqing, who are both from Documented, which is a New York City-based outlet focusing on immigrant communities. Rong is a New York-based journalist and Alicia Patterson Fellow. She writes for various English and Chinese language publications, and her articles have appeared everywhere from Foreign Policy to New York Times to The Nation, and Wired and everywhere, and has been supported by various grants and fellowships. And Max Siegelbaum, who is the co-executive director of Documented. He has worked all over from post-revolution Egypt to writing for newspapers in Denver and Pittsburgh, has investigated healthcare conditions for detained immigrants with mental illness, due process violations of immigrant courts, and inconsistently enforced laws. So I'm so glad to have this group. I wanted to start by having each of them just briefly describe the work that they're here representing as part of the Collier Awards. They all have such an incredible body of work, but we'll probably focus the most on their Collier Awards work. So maybe if we could just start with you, Rong and Max.
Sure. Our story is about, in the background of China and the US relationship getting intense, how the Chinese community, ordinary Chinese, are affected by that. Turn out that everyone's living in fear for different reasons, because some people are worried about the Chinese Communist Party they have this long arms and trying to control their speech and trying to persecute them somehow because of what they said in the US. Other people worried the FBI has cast a overbroad dragnet that would basically portray or label most of the Chinese for working for the CCP, working for the Chinese government's interest. So everyone's in fear, and how did this happen? Why did this happen? And how did people deal with this? And that's our story.
And I was the editor on this project, and it was probably one of the more complex stories we've done at Documented. There were a lot of ethical issues as well as storytelling issues that we had to navigate. Last night Rong mentioned it was a 9,000-word draft, so we had to cut that down. But in a time when it is incredibly fraught and people's rights are being violated, it's not really like a neat story that you can just package up and give to people. But it's also a very important one, especially as we see what's happening today. So it was also very kind of difficult story security-wise. Our website underwent a pretty significant series of digital attacks while we were reporting the story. Rong later got a notice that the foreign government was trying to break into her email and that the platforms that we were using were very insecure. So we had to kind of navigate all of that at once while producing the story.
Wow. So about 3 months after the Baltimore Banner began publication in 2022, our colleague Justin Fenton, who's in the audience today, was contacted by a group of former members of an evangelical international megachurch, which is headquartered in Baltimore. And these former members said that they had launched their own investigation into sexual abuse in the church after they had learned that many of them had a family member or friend or loved one who had been abused, and who also felt that they had been in some way silenced or their concerns dismissed when they brought them to church leadership. And that was the beginning of a lengthy process of first Justin and Jessica, and then they brought me on, building connections with the Millstones, building trust with them, and ultimately developing a relationship with the people who had disclosed their own stories of abuse with the Millstones, and finally getting to the point where they were comfortable with us publishing their stories. They very much wanted the story out there and they wanted people to be aware of it, but they were terrified to be the ones that were putting the story out there. They had been, most of them had been born into this church and educated in the church's schools from preschool all the way through their unaccredited Bible college. It was, for most of them, the only education they had. And it was a church that filled up every free moment of their lives. They had this programming that taught them that it was wrong to express concerns about church leadership because church leaders were so close to God that to criticize them was to criticize God. So we worked through a lot of psychological barriers with them in building trust and allowing them us to tell their stories.
I just wanted to add one piece here. We're a local newsroom in Baltimore, and the survivors that we spoke with were in multiple states, multiple continents. I mean, just the logistics of speaking to people in other time zones was so complex. We ultimately were so lucky that many of the people we spoke with for the story were willing to speak on the record and have their photos taken. And then that became another challenge of, fantastic. And how do we find a freelancer in Accra, Ghana? And, we were able to get through each of those hurdles to tell the story well.
Yeah, Helen, if you could tell me a little bit about when you first started working with Ariane on her piece.
Is this on? Yes. First, I just want to give a plug to Documented. Hi, Max. Because Max and his co-founder, Mazin, well, Mazin was my student at Columbia, so Documented comes out of that. It's brilliant. It's the only news outlet I know of that isn't just about immigrants, but for immigrants. And they have a Chinese language. They have Spanish, they have Creole, right? And I'm a big supporter, so you should all sign up for it right now. Okay, ad over. Yes, so Ariane, at the Columbia Journalism School, everybody has to write a master's thesis, which is one long article that lasts all year, and they choose their advisors to oversee it. And Ariane chose me because I'd been writing about refugees from the Middle East, including Afghanistan, for a long time. And her story was about our Afghan allies, whom we'd been throwing under the bus for a really long time. But she updated that by finding a pilot who, when we withdrew, under the Biden administration, he was ordered to fly out of the country, and then he could never go back again. But his family, his wife and children, The rest of his family was still in Afghanistan. He got evacuated here and applied to have them brought out of danger here, and it's never happened, and it still hasn't happened, and he's just one of many, 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 many. So he hasn't seen them since. So that was the thrust of her piece. He wasn't the only person that she interviewed, but he was the main character. And the challenges there were not only his own danger, but especially the danger of his family and circle under the Taliban back home, where any association with America is a death sentence. So she had to handle that by I suggested this actually because it's what I've discovered in my work, is not treating your sources as sources, but treating them as partners. So you get on this, you have a discussion together about why they want to do the story, why you want to do the story. You find the common ground and the common goal, and you always work together on how to do this in a way that will keep that person safe. And later on, I can add a lot more tips along that. But I'm a great believer in dismantling that traditional distance of the journalist and the source, and that sort of cold exterior superior thing we do in the West, and just to see them as experts in their own lives, which you are not. So you're lucky to be talking to them. That's my attitude, and I think it makes a big difference in how stories turn out and how Ariane's story turned out.
I think that's very thoughtfully said, and I feel like you can see those rich, trusting relationships in all of the work by the people on this panel. You can see the evidence of the time that was spent and invested in building those relationships. I wanted to start kind of at the beginning of that relationship, which is finding and locating your sources. And I think and maybe others, you don't always think about like the ethics of even identifying who you're going to talk to. And I thought, Rong, your piece was really interesting in that. And you wrote in your submission that you were talking to sources on WeChat, but WeChat also has a history of being compromised by the Chinese government. And so Documented had to think really thoughtfully about how even those first initial conversations were going to happen. So I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your process and strategy for how you identified who you were going to talk to and how you thought about, keeping them safe.
Sure. About WeChat is we did discuss this a lot. It's not secured, and my editors suggested that I downloaded some other software and asked my sources download like Signal or something. It just not gonna work because these people, I can download another software. They never would use that. Almost every single Chinese immigrant here in this country using WeChat. And even if you ask them to download another software, they'll shift back. They'll just say, I sometimes I was wondering, you don't know, you're not supposed to say these things on WeChat, especially when you type things there. That's going to be evidence or something. I'm very careful to not, say whatever I want on WeChat, but sometimes you really can't control them. They don't know how dangerous it was. But in terms of selecting sources, we really spent a lot of energy and time to consider who we're going to shed light on, because it's such a complicated situation. While you have some innocent Chinese who were, questioned by the oversensitive FBI agents, but at the same time, you do have some people who are really working for the CCP to surveillance other Chinese immigrants here. You don't want to select someone who is actually a good manipulator, and then turn out, after our story published, this person is arrested and charged. That's so. We spend a lot of time. The reason we chose this lady to start our story and ending our story was, thanks to a retired FBI agent I interviewed, whom I didn't quote in the story, but he basically walked me through about, when the FBI approached you, what their intention would be. He said there are 3 possibilities. 1, you're their target, and 2, you're their witness, and 3, they want to recruit you as an informant. But they won't tell you when they talk to you. They won't tell you which category you belong to. But based on what he told me, how the questions would be said and things, I kind of figured that this lady is someone whom they want to recruit as informant. She is definitely not their target. So, and based on what she said and all the things, I think is credible. What she said, like she didn't do this, she didn't do that, and she explained her political views, which I think is very credible. So, that's the reason we decided to use her as our main character.
And Jessica and Julie, your experience was a little different because your sources came to you after doing this investigation for a while amongst themselves, and then approached you as journalists. And you mentioned this idea of wanting the story to be told, but trying to figure out how it would be told, and also reckoning with the larger audience it might reach through being published in a newspaper. And so I just wanted to learn a little bit about how you built that trust and how you built those foundational relationships, and what it began as and how it grew.
I'll take that one. So we had been speaking with the Millstones, our sources, who are the former church members who did this investigation for many months, and very slowly, bit by bit, working up to make the ask of them to say, we want you to be central characters in our story. It was not easy. We were worried. Really, it was Justin that sort of forced our hand and said, it's time. We have to do it. We have to tell them. Because we knew from the very first time that Justin and I sat down with them, they described to us this scene where they're all around the bonfire. It's the top of our story. And they learn one by one that each of the people sitting around the bonfire has a relative who's a victim of child sexual abuse within this church. And they didn't know before. We were like, oh my God, these people have to be part of this story. It can't just be about the victims themselves. It has to be about the investigators, the citizen investigators, is how we described it. And ultimately, once it was only after we had developed that trust that we felt we could make the ask and expect that it was going to be successful. And it was. And it's sort of funny, after the stories were published, the Millstones came to us and were like, actually, we're right. The story works better, with us as part of it, even though we weren't comfortable with that initially.
And you mentioned time, but were there other, elements or strategies you did to kind of to build that trust and get you to the point where you felt comfortable making that ask?
I'll also add too that we interviewed dozens of victims of abuse and their loved ones who corroborated their stories as well. So it was almost a writing challenge or a narrative challenge. How do we take all this information that we've gathered and how do we turn it into something that's interesting and readable, not an indictment, but a story that people will be interested in? And what we realized was that we needed to have the Millstones as our guide into that story. So it was a lengthy process to kind of make that pitch to them because, again, part of the programming they had gotten in the church was to not draw attention to themselves. So I remember having these lengthy phone conversations with Matt, who was one of the leaders of the Millstones. And it was like late winter. I remember I was just sort of pacing through my neighborhood, talking to him on the phone and saying that, that the victims needed him, that we needed him to kind of be the guide for our readers into the story. And that was really convincing to them because they realized that it was in fact sort of an altruistic act for them to be publicly exposed and have their names and their likenesses printed, and that would enable them to highlight the stories of the victims. Because one of the things they said, and something that they were very attuned to, was that the Millstones were not victims themselves, And so they didn't want to sort of steal the spotlight from the people who were victimized. So that took a lot of lengthy conversations. We had a Signal group chat with them that was, we were getting dozens of messages a day, but it was also a lot of these phone conversations and a bond that was formed over time.
Yeah, I think you can tell in just hearing you talk about the piece and in the piece, just the depth of understanding of the institution of the church, but also these people's relationship with their faith, which it definitely seems like a way that, allowed you to kind of reframe the piece in a way that fit into that worldview. So I think that's definitely something that we can all take away and maybe apply to our own work. I'm wondering, Helen, for you, when Ariane first brought this idea to you, she says, I want to write about this Afghan pilot. It's, he's in the middle of, him and his family are in the middle of kind of this larger geopolitical conflict. This attention could be so damaging and so scary. What was your first reaction? What were the risks that you immediately thought about, and what were the things that you advised her, I guess, in taking on this kind of challenging subject and this very specific source?
Well, first I said, whenever you are interviewing people who are in particularly vulnerable situations, dangerous situations, you should inform yourself about exactly what the dangers are. You can't assume that they're going to know everything about it. I mean, sometimes sources take more risks than they should. Especially in the excitement of pouring out their hearts to you. If you've really clicked with them and they trust you, they sometimes forget how vulnerable they're making themselves. And then it is your job. I mean, I think a really important mantra is do no harm. So I said, make sure you really understand, where his family is, how much are they in the sights of the Taliban. Is he being monitored when he communicates with them? All that stuff. Ariane is a data person. So she came to me with all the background, like data stats, on what had happened to Afghan allies in general for so long and who did what. But it was very number crunching, so we had to put a human face on it. So she began reaching out to people, and a lot of people were afraid to talk to her, similar, I'm sure that everyone else has experienced here. Took her a long time to find the right people. And then the thing about the pilot is he really wanted his name used. So she had to go through this over and over with him at every different stage, like when she sold the article, or when she first finished a draft, when she sold the article, when it was about to be published, after it was published. Are you sure you're still okay with this? Are you sure you're still okay? These are the risks. So we discussed doing that a lot. But his family gone into hiding, and he felt that they were safe. The only thing I would say that I regret is, and I think she would agree with this, we've discussed it, is it would have been better if in the article, and I think this is important for all journalists these days, to explain exactly what the agreement had been more, because you readers couldn't always tell all the due diligence she'd done, and some people accused her of putting him in danger, not knowing how hard she'd worked not to. So I think just being transparent, especially because right now the public has absolutely no idea of what we actually do and how hard we work and what fact-checking means and, evidence-based proof and all that. So I think we do have to be really transparent about the agreements we make with the sources, why their names are used or not used, and the discussions we had. So that was sort of where we started off. And she worked at it really hard, and it worked out.
And I want to stay on this idea of names, using names, anonymity, because I think notably everyone who's up here, names were used in their articles for vulnerable sources who were named. And Helen, you just very thoughtfully worked us through how Ariane got to that decision, but I would love to hear from both Julie and Jessica and Max and Rong about how you decided who was named, naming, how sources responded to that, and just the relationship between anonymity and harm, and just how you navigated that in your work.
I couldn't believe, as we went through the interview process, just how many of these sources said, I want to be fully on the record. First name, last name, send somebody out to take my picture tomorrow. They were just so brave. Yeah. And so many of these people that we spoke to about Greater Grace were telling their stories for the very first time, like had not ever told some of their relatives. So just that bravery I thought was extraordinary. Now, there were some circumstances where people were not comfortable using their names, and of course that requires a different level of scrutiny from our team at the Banner, as well as our attorney, to make sure that we were all comfortable with our choices. And then we actually had another circumstance. Maybe you want to talk about Clica?
I was speaking earlier about Matt, one of the millstones. His wife had been a victim of an abuse that was somewhat more subtle. She wasn't raped or physically violated in the same way that some of our other sources were, but she was groomed and she was manipulated, and this pastor had a deep psychological hold on her. He told her that when she was a teenager, a student actually in his high school class, that God had decreed that she would be his wife, even though he was 20 years older and married to another woman. And so she had this...
God said the woman was going to die.
Yeah. God said a lot of things. And so he had this deep hold on her, and she had a lot of fear with coming forward with her story. It took a tremendous amount of conversations for her to feel comfortable doing that. And we made agreements that we don't often make, but I agreed to read her quotes back to her. I agreed to fact check with her in a way that would reveal what was disclosed in the article without, of course, reading the whole article, but so that she had a level of comfort knowing what sorts of details were revealed. And it was such an arduous process. I had this conversation with Matt and Joe, a few days before we were finally about to publish. And it was about this, it was a 2-hour process going over all of this material. Matt, who's a therapist, we were talking on the phone, and Matt, who's a therapist, would say, well, I'm going to pause there because I see Joe is shaking. She's having a physical reaction to hearing that these details are in the story. And the detail was that he had touched her waist, which sounds relatively innocuous. But to her, it was very painful to hear that, just to know that this was being published. There were also emails that were exchanged between the pastor and herself as a high school student that they had referenced. At first, they were not comfortable allowing us to see them. Matt, we had a Zoom in which Matt flashed them on the Zoom screen so I could see that they existed, but I wasn't allowed to take screenshots. And then I went back and persuaded them, and eventually they did allow me to see copies of them and to quote from them in the article, which I think made the article much stronger. But right after I got off that fact-checking call, our editor called to kind of go over some words, which was a whole other hour-long conversation. And I was like, I just need to go for a run. And it was starting to rain, and we live right by the woods. And I went running in the woods in a thunderstorm, which is really not a good idea. But I was so in my head and out of my body that it felt incredibly soothing to move my body, feel my heartbeat, hear the thunder, and just kind of get back into my body after just being in my head and my emotions and pulled through their emotions for such a long period of time.
Wow, that's interesting. I think for me, as an editor, the important part of kind of approaching the sources like you would someone you're writing a story that is damning about, or the target of the investigation, like the Amazon story they were talking about earlier, and using that same level of intentionality to make sure they really know everything that's going on in the story, explaining the media and how it works. A lot of people, it'll be the first time that they'll ever engage with a reporter. And we come across this all the time. And I make sure, and I think we talked about this a lot, they know the exposure and the risk that they're subjecting themselves to, and you don't make any promises about how this will help them or this will hurt them, because you have no idea. And really hammering that as much as possible, because at the end of the day, they are choosing to speak to you. And they also get to choose whether or not they include their name, but they might not have all the information. So that's how we approach this story, and that's how we approach all the other work we do at Documented.
I'll just add one more thing, that for this story, as I said yesterday, that we had to probably talk to a few dozens people, and just one or two who would like to speak on the record. So most of the people don't want us to use their names or any real identity. For those few who would like to, their real names to be used, we went out kind of like extra length to ask them. I mean, this is probably counterintuitive, to ask them, really, are you sure? Why do you want your name to be used in this piece? So when they gave me some reasons, if it sounded like that's realistic reasons, their expectations are realistic, I'd say, okay, we can keep going. If they have unrealistic expectation from this piece, I'd rather not take their names. You know, for example, there's this student who the police in China accused him of involving in some student organization in Washington, D.C. that aims to overturn the Chinese government. The police in China had already talked to his sister and his brother, his father and his sister. So when he talked to me, I said, don't you worry that they're gonna, do even worse things to your family? Because I talked to other students who were involved with this organization, and those students were like shaking when I talked to them. Their faces were pale. They really didn't want to talk about it. So this person said, I thought that the worst has already happened. And what they know about my involvement or my not involvement, they have already known. The thing had already happened, and the organization now is not active anymore. So I just want to put it on record that I'm not involved in the formation of this organization. So I think, okay, that's that's a right, sound reasonable reason. So that's how did we make the judgment.
Can I add one more thing there,
of
Ryan?
course.
I just remembered there was another source that we spoke with who initially was on board. She wanted her story told. And then at the last second, she said, I can't do it. I'm pulling out. We were preparing to send a photographer to her home. And the next day she said, I can't do this. And we said, okay, we understand. Her material was taken out of the story. A few months passed. We were getting closer to publication. We checked in with her again, and she said, I've changed my mind. I'm ready. I'm on the record. Send the photographer. That led us to completely rip up our story too. But it was really powerful where we landed. And now that woman has become one of the most aggressive advocates for victims within this church in the aftermath of publication. And her abuser is under criminal investigation and may well be charged very soon.
I'd like to add something too, picking up on what Max said. It's true that I think a lot of sources believe that by talking to journalists, something will happen. That somebody will be brought to justice, or a law will be changed, or their families will be. They think we have more power than we do, and it's really important to be absolutely honest about how little power we really have. And I've been challenged a lot, especially when I was doing work with refugees, and trapped in these horrible camps in Greece, they'd say, journalists come around here and nothing ever changes. So why should I talk to you? And I said, you don't have to, because I can't promise I'll change anything either. I just think it's better than not telling these stories at all. It's better than silence, up to you. So that's important. So my mantra really is never make a promise you can't keep. And if you do make a promise, be sure you keep it. And that to me is really important. An ethical standard as a journalist. Sometimes it's tempting to pretend you have more power than you have to get people to talk to you, especially when you're beginning. Don't do that, because it really hurts people.
Yeah, and that gets to actually kind of, the final point I wanted to talk about before we open up to questions, because I would love to hear your audience questions, which is exactly navigating that line between journalist and advocate, especially when you have folks that you've spent a lot of time with, who you've built relationships with, have put your trust in you. And I guess, what are times that you can remember where you navigated that tension, and ways that you were clear while also being clear about what you could do and what you could offer? And just, I'd love to hear just a little bit more, because it was great for you for kicking off that conversation from Jessica and Julie and Rong and Max about navigating that line, especially because I know Documented occupies this kind of interesting service journalism space. So I think you would all have really interesting perspectives on that.
I have never thought myself as an advocate while I do my journalistic work. If there's anything that I'm trying to reach with a story like this, that could be bordering with advocacy, I'd say, I put the interest of the entire Chinese community in my mind. These are people I really care about. I don't want them to live like this, under fear every day. And they come to this country for a better life. They should, and they have the rights to enjoy a better life. So that's, if that's advocacy, and that's the thing I'm fighting for. But I don't take side on anything, or I'm not trying to persuade the readers, okay, this person is a good person, that person is a bad person, or this faction of the community is good, that faction is wrong. That's not what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. A lot of people we come across have no connections to any of the things that are available to them. They just spend their days wandering the city looking for jobs, going into stores, asking if there work. Some of them are sleeping on the subway or in mosques or whatever it is. And then they meet a journalist who's sympathetic and wants to hear their story and wants to write about it and seemingly wants to help them. So they start asking, like, do you know where I can find a job? Do you know this? Do you know that? Can you help me? And I think it's really challenging for our reporters to be in that position, because the person asking them directly for help, and it's hard to navigate. It's not reporting on some big powerful institution. They're just out here alone. So I think where we have landed is just creating a robust set of stories and service journalism pieces where we approach these problems through just a fact-based gathering information with a lot of the caveats that we'll use in the reporting. So like New York City has a list of legal service providers that offer free support. All of them are completely overburdened, and most people experience inability to get any sort of legal help through them. So we'll send them that list, and also the caveat that this is what we hear most people's experiences are. But once, if you start getting involved in individual people, it's not helpful to you as a reporter. It's not helpful to them, and it's not helpful to the fact that like we're serving the entire city and not just the few people we come across. So as things come up, as new problems arise, as the world changes, we try to kind of keep up with what's the services, the nonprofits, and all of it, and just approach it like other news organizations. You know, I was looking at the New York Times the other day. They had a story on how to patch a hole in your wall. You know, it's like a step by step, you know, get the sheetrock thing and all that. And it's, you know, it's joking, but it is a similar approach to that. How do you get a visa? How do you get a green card, a street vendor permit? How do you apply for asylum? And just sort of try to break all these things down and send them to people as these questions arise.
I talk a bit to that as well. I think I'm in a slightly different position when it comes to this, when to help and whether to help, because I write books. So I spend years and years and years interviewing certain people, and we get to know each other very, very well. And with the refugees, for example, who I wrote about in my book, they were living on the edge, so that, I mean, honestly, $1 or $2 or a phone number could make the difference between them sleeping on the street or not, going to prison or not, getting medical care or not. So there are times as a journalist when you have to ask yourself which feels better, to help or not help. So I'm not quite as rigid about this. I actually believe, especially when somebody's given months and months and months of their time to you to tell their story and collaborate on your book, I think we do owe them something, even if it's just a link to a website to tell them how to access things like you just listed, or to a legal service that's free. But sometimes it's a handful of change. But I actually do believe in giving back to some extent like that. Not beforehand, not in any way that compromises the relationship between the interviewee and the interviewer. If you pay people ahead of time, I still believe that the idea that this makes them feel beholden to you, it tempts them to say things they might not want to say, or feel that they have to please you. It sets up an awkwardness between you. But when it's over, and you know them well, and you trust them, and they trust you, I don't see any harm in helping sometimes.
What our sources wanted was justice and accountability, and also to protect the children that are in the church now. And that was challenging because one of the teachings of this church is that you may not read or even hear an evil report about the church. So if there's some content out there that says something bad about this church, you're not allowed to receive it. So we knew for the people that most needed to hear this information, if they were following the tenets of the church, they wouldn't even read our articles. We also knew that the church, unlike people that you write about that threatened to sue, this church barely spoke to us, the leaders of the church, before we published. So we really had no idea how they were going to respond after the fact. So there was no ability to make any promises about whether justice, accountability, or increased safety was possible. But we were very pleased in the aftermath of the work that the church, of its own volition and in response to feedback from congregants, launched an internal investigation that they're paying for with private money that is ongoing right now. It's incredible.
One of the things that I found really interesting in doing this kind of work, great, someone's probably calling me to refinance my car or something, is to see sources become advocates themselves. A couple years ago, I did a story about a toxic work culture at a state park, and this longtime manager was accused of raping 2 employees. And I talked to all these people who were very afraid to come forward, and eventually shared their stories of harassment at the hands of this park manager. That helped me build the skills to report the Greater Grace story. I also did stories about the Catholic Church abuse, and spoke to one of the women from the Keepers, who was a tremendous researcher. And when the Greater Grace story came out, this woman from the Keepers made contact with the Millstones and said, like, we want to help you, like, let's work together. And then most recently, just a few months ago, Justin and I teamed up and wrote a series of stories about massage therapists accusing Ravens kicker Justin Tucker of acting inappropriately during massages. And when that story came out, I got super nice notes from the Greater Grace folks, from the Gunpowder State Falls people, from the Keepers, and like, it's just really neat how you kind of see this community growing of victims and sources who then become advocates for others in other situations and scenarios. So it's neat to kind of like, it's this weird sort of impact that I don't even know how to talk about, but a sense of like community building, which feels really powerful.
One thing to add to that, Julie mentioned the Keepers, and when the Greater Grace people had their protest at the church after our articles were published, it was women from the Keepers that showed up and held up the portraits of our survivors, standing along the road that leads to this church. It was extraordinary.
Could I just add something to that?
Sure, one thing, and then we'll open up to questions. But go ahead, Matt.
I just in our own work, I think a lot of the times people don't even know what happened to them was wrong, or maybe they do know, but just to like see it in print and have someone say it definitively, that was illegal, that was maybe morally incorrect. I think it can be really powerful, and it kind of fits with some of this, what we're talking.
Absolutely. Well, you just got a little taste of the incredible work that these fine journalists have created, but please read their entire work, and we'll open up to questions for like 10, 15 minutes if people have any.
Hi, my name is India Rice. I'm a student here at the Journalism Institute. And my question is about like your endings of your stories, and how do you ethically go about not promising a better future or promising something at the end of the story, but coming to some sort of resolve that concludes the story in a meaningful way?
Well, in my case, our story is there's no real ending, right? Our main character herself still doesn't know what's really happened to her. So our ending is an open ending. It's quite like just about her confusion, right? She had this dream, and then in the dream, she called people, nobody answered. She asked people where she was, nobody talked to her. Everyone kept silence, and then she said she woke up in cold sweat, and she said, "I just want an answer." So what is that answer? We don't know. She doesn't know. Maybe nobody knows. So that's our ending.
I think a lot of times a article like this doesn't end like an essay where you're summing. It ends like a poem. Like you just want to like hit this one last note that will resonate and kind of keep people thinking. But there usually aren't neat, tidy answers, especially right when your first story comes out.
Do you want to describe more about Ryan and the actual ending of our third story?
That was wild. So for one of our sources whose sister was a victim and who was an advocate, I accompanied him to go back to the church for the first time since he had left sort of, rather dramatically a few years before. And so I was seated a few rows back where I could keep an eye on him. And he was actually worried for his safety. And so he was glad that I was there also just to witness in case anything happened to him. And there were heavily armed security guards who were talking to him and staring at him. So it was a bit intense. But after the service, he managed to sort of slip into the crowd and then go up to the head pastor. He like sort of clapped the head pastor on the shoulder in a congenial way. And then he whispered in his ear, "The millstones are coming." And so that was a fun way to end that story.
very satisfying for Ryan.
Yeah, I would just add the same. It doesn't have to have an upbeat ending. It doesn't have to have a little bow at the end of it. It usually, especially with expose sort of stories about wrongdoing, it usually it opens and ends in a question. They look to the future, but it could go all sorts of ways, kind of ending.
This isn't a question so much as a comment. I thought it was so spot on, especially as we talk about ethics, to talk about looking out for sources when they're not necessarily looking out for themselves. You know, so often we're trying to get something. When we get it, we're excited. But like, we need to think about the implications of what actually does that mean for the people who gave it to us. And we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of the death of Freddie Gray in police custody. I always tell this story to my sources to try to gain trust. I got his autopsy leaked to me at a time, and it was highly sought after, very under lock and key. And my editors wanted to put it online. They wanted to scan it and put it online. And I said, what if there's some and the source hadn't said this to me, but I said, I was worried there might be some defect on it that only that person's copy has. And if we put it online, we could compromise them. So we had a middle ground where we typed up what it said. But I just think that's really important to emphasize for people to look out for your sources.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, we are responsible. And this is something I'm always telling my students is, you know, even when you're a beginning journalist, you have an enormous power just in taking on that you become the conveyor from a human being to the public, and they're filtered entirely through you. So you have so much power over the way they're seen and the way they're interpreted and what people do with it. So you really have to take that responsibility seriously.
My name is Sebastian Gomez. I'm also a graduate student at NYU. I was wondering, when coming up with the process of, okay, all right. I was wondering if what happens when coming up with the interview. How do you come across asking these questions that might make your sources feel uncomfortable?
So I'll often acknowledge that. I'll say, you know, this is an uncomfortable question to ask, and it's, you know, likely going to be uncomfortable to answer. You know, I will talk to sources before we begin and say, you know, we can take breaks. We can, you know, if you don't want to continue the interview, we can stop. We can talk about going back to it another time. I try to, my little mantra for myself is to try to sort of have like the demeanor of a social worker, but like the mind of a lawyer, you know? So I'm like, try to be sort of like warm and comforting and asking lots of open-minded questions, but also in the back of my head, I'm always like, okay, like, does this add up? Does that add up? Have I asked about this? Have we connected these dots yet? But I think a lot of times just sort of having an empathetic demeanor and kind of having a lot of open conversation to set expectations for what that conversation will be like. And then just to kind of give them the gift of time and space, and to know that they can come back later, or also they can choose to just sort of discontinue things at any given point.
Another thing I would add, you remember I said at the beginning about treating your sources as partners? Well, I use this a lot when I interview people who've been through traumas, whether it's sexual abuse or war or or whatever, torture. I start off by asking, what do you want people to know about who you are? And what do you think is most important for people to know? So they're guiding the interview in a way. They're saying what's important to them the most. I never directly go to what happened to you, what did he do to you, or what did they do to you, or even with refugees, why did you leave? Because that just goes straight to the trauma. I never open with that. I prefer to open with more neutral questions that let them set the agenda, and then when they feel comfortable, they will tell me. I don't know what your approach to that was, because again, I usually am doing this in the context of books, so I have more time to go slowly, thank goodness. But how did you handle that?
Yeah, I was going to add that I often ask people to just start at the beginning, whatever they determine the beginning to be. And it's a natural entry point into a wider view of their full story. But then the other thing I wanted to add was with such sensitive topics like the ones we've been discussing, it's so common for people to have a physical, emotional response. Sometimes people are breaking down into tears, and to just hold space for that requires, on my part, a sort of anticipation that it could happen and to feel prepared. Because sometimes when you just two humans under any circumstances, there's something emotional and vulnerable happening. There's a reflexive response like, oh, we have to end it. And in this case, you really want to create that space and allow it to continue and see where it all leads.
I think we have time for one more question. I saw some hands here. Okay, great.
My name is Yue Jiang, and right now I was doing my internship at the United Nations Social Media Department, and I'm just about to start my journey as journalist in the autumn, and I really love your stories about how you provide different perspectives and how you show your care for the people in your community, and also Ms. Rong, you have mentioned that you don't want your people to live under fear, and I was particularly interested that have you ever been live under fear of being targeted by the power, and do you have any advices for new beginners? Thank you.
Yeah, constantly. Even this story, I expected both sides would attack me. I actually, it's just happened. Now the world is so polarized, and the Chinese community as well, very polarized. Whatever you say, you would become the target of internet troll or something, either by people on this side or on the other side. So I've been prepared for this, but fortunately for this story, that didn't happen. So I think, now I realized it's possible still, even in this polarized world, if you try your best to cover the story in a very objective way, to make it complete and to be fair to all different sides, it still could happen that people won't just attack you. But I can tell you that I do live in fear every day as a reporter, but I still feel there's some work I need to do. If I don't do that, I can't survive. I have to do what I think I need to do. So in between choosing whether to live in fear or whether to not survive, I'd rather choose to live in fear.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists on this panel. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to audience members who came for one, or the many of you that stayed from 10 to 2. Thank you all for being here. This is our final Collier Awards event of our first year, and we're so grateful for everybody who was involved. This has been such a wonderful experience. Thank you all.